Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. This is part 2 of our lecture on the Great Depression. Now, as always, before we begin, hit pause on this video, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and again, pay attention to those key terms at the left. Let's get started. Now, when we left off last time, we were discussing the causes of the Great Depression. Of course, we left off on the slide right here. It's going to get worse. But don't worry. We have a president who has a plan. And sure enough, President Herbert Hoover says, quote, "The fundamental business of the country is sound," unquote. In other words, don't worry. Corporations have got it. They've got it all handled. The fundamental business of our country is sound. And the markets will rebound. Hold on, let me go back to my slide. Yep, they didn't. The economy collapses even further. From 1929 to 1932, the economy is gutted. Americans' personal incomes decline by more than half. Unemployment skyrockets. Farmers who are already having problems are leveled and hit harder. Thousands are being foreclosed upon. Hundreds of factories and mines are failing. Prosperity gives way to gloom. As recession gave way to the worst depression in our history or the world has ever seen. More than 9,000 banks closed permanently. And since there's no insurance for your money, if you had any of your life savings or all your life savings in one of these banks, it's gone. There is no getting it back. If the bank closes, any money you put there is gone. You'd be better off lighting it on fire and use it for warmth. Or using it for the bathroom and wipe your butt with it. And of course, if your life savings is gone, you aren't buying anything. Remember, the economy in the United States and much of the world only functions if you, me, and all those around us are buying stuff. Think of that for a minute. How much power we have as consumers. Apple will never make another product if people just didn't buy it. But because people keep buying it, and convincing us that we want it, we keep buying them. Hence, my iPhone. And of course, you guys can't see this, but I have a MacBook I'm doing this on. And I have my notes on an iPad. And, and my watch too. I like Apple. So I'm making fun of myself here. Because you're not buying anything, though, there's, again, chain reaction here. So the banks foreclose. You can't pay it back. They close permanently. They close their doors. Your money is now gone. You can't buy stuff. Guess what? Now manufacturers can't keep manufacturing things. A manufacturer can't keep producing the latest iPhone, the latest refrigerator, the latest radio, the latest Model T. They can't do that because no one's buying things. And then, because they're not producing things, that means you, as a worker, don't have a job. They can't afford to keep paying to come in and do nothing all the time. I mean, this makes sense, right? So, stock market crashed, banks recall loans, they don't get the loans back, they call back in your private loans, you can't pay it back, they shut their doors, you lose your life savings, you are now so worried about money, you don't have any money, you can't buy things, therefore the companies don't produce things, because the companies don't produce things, they're not paying employees to make things, which means you have no job now. Again, it's very cyclical. And as a result of this and then you add to this, by the 1920s, even though we said America first, Harding's policy, and even though we were trying to be more isolationist, the global economic marketplace already existed. And therefore there will be a trickle across the entire world. This would be a global phenomenon, which is going to directly lead into a couple lectures from now, World War II. We'll talk about that. So by 1933, though, 13 million people are out of work. Those who kept their jobs were working reduced hours, half days, quarter days, whatever they can get. Banks are closed, farms are bankrupt. People are not only jobless, but they're homeless, penniless, hungry, and hopeless. Remember, there's no safety net. There is no government program that will help you. There's no food stamps. There's no unemployment insurance. There's no unemployment. In 2020, coronavirus, right? The government passed an extra $600 on top of the already, unemployment you could receive if you were unemployed because your job laid you off, right? Due to coronavirus. And there's a big debate at the end of July whether or not to continue that or not, which has lapsed in August. But there's none of that back in the 1920s. There's no government program. Remember, laissez-faire, hands-off, small government. And as a result, who then can help the people? Well, it comes to a helping hand from local churches, soup kitchens, who begin to draw huge lines of hungry people, kids, adults. Yes, and it even went this far. That is not a misprint. 4 children for sale. Many poor people in their destitution began to actually sell their kids. Now, I understand, I show this slide every year and people are horrified, and you should be. This is sad, this is wrong. But think about the choice those parents had here. They were starving. The hope was sell your kid to a wealthy person. This will A, allow the kid to live, because the rich person will take care of them theoretically. And B, it'll get you a little money too to survive and not starve. Because the alternative is, because there's no jobs, the alternative is, remember, we're at 25% unemployment in the Great Depression. The alternative is to literally watch your children die of starvation. That's your option. So yes, people sold their kids. Now I have a little cartoon for you here, just because I think it's a little more fun to see the cartoon version. So here's a relief line. Here's a little cartoon for you, just for fun. A Depression era cartoon. Oh, fun fact, by the way. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was originally a creation of Walt Disney. By the 1930s, he had been sold to a separate company. So life is good, the Roaring 20s.
Come on, girls, get to work.
I tell him, why don't you hire me? I talk with Margaret. I tell him, just refuse.
Hi, boss.
Oh, yes. Come on, girls, check in. Nice work, Mildred. Keep it up. Janet, you can do better than that.
In other words, there are signs that the bad is coming. And now we're in depression.
Doctor, 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 doctor.
And of course, the problem is no one knows what to do. This is the problem. No one has a clue what to do with this. And of course, Herbert Hoover is, don't worry, the fundamental foundation of our country is strong. It'll bounce back. But it doesn't. Again, 9,000 banks are closed. We are now at 25% unemployment. People are literally selling their kids. Oh, and by the way, this is the problem. If you're white. It is far worse if you are black. The Depression, of course, will hit African Americans even harder. By 1932, that national average of 25% unemployment, no. That's not for blacks. Black unemployment was up to 50% by 1932. And the thing is, during economic downturns, Americans want someone to blame, right? You want to find someone to blame. Someone's stealing your jobs. Someone is the one who caused this. And of course, it's not you. It can't be you. Therefore, you look for someone to blame. It could be immigrants. But often, as is often the case in our history, the first blame went to African Americans. And they were the perfect scapegoat. And we would see a resurgence of increased racism and increased lynchings during the 1930s. Now, one of the most highest profile incidents during the 1930s was the case of the Scottsboro Boys. Now, the Scottsboro Boys are 9 black teenagers. And what they had done is they had been illegally riding the rails. Now, riding the rails means you jumped on the train and you just try to hitch a ride for free to the next town. That it's illegal, you didn't buy a ticket, granted. And so these 9 black teenagers jumped on the train illegally and was riding the rails looking for work. Now, when they got on the train and they were headed towards Scottsboro, Alabama, 2 white women got off the train and accused these 9 black boys of raping them. But what's interesting to note is that was not the original charge. The Scottsboro Boys were initially arrested for a very minor charge, riding the rails, or loitering, a charge off that idea. But only after police pressured these women, they said, oh no, yeah, they raped us. So the case goes to trial, and within 2 weeks, 8 of the 9 boys were sentenced to death by an all-white jury. Now, one of them, the youngest, 13 years old, was sentenced to life in prison. Now, of course, these convictions they rested upon the testimony of these 2 white women, one of whom later admitted that she'd been pressured to lie and that these boys were framed. Now, it took another decade of appeals, and finally, 4 of the boys had the charges dropped, but the other 5 still received lengthy sentences, even after a decade of appeals, and one of the women recanting her testimony. But the point of this was This is a high-profile symbol of racism and prejudice in Great Depression America. That you would be able to sentence 8 of them to death, even after one of the women's recants. 5 will receive lengthy sentences. In fact, 1 took 20 years to get out of prison, despite the fact that the woman recanted. Oh, and then if thought things could get worse, who's another common scapegoat? Who's always stealing our jobs according to white America? The Mexicans, right? And Mexican Americans were hit particularly hard in the Depression. Again, looking for someone to blame, as quote-unquote real Americans were out of work, they often turned to blaming Mexicans for stealing their jobs. Now, throughout the country, things were bad. Here in Texas, now again, I was very fortunate during my research for my dissertation that I got to listen to a lot of interviews, including some who lived through the Depression for Mexican Americans. And as a young child living in Depression-era Texas, in San Antonio, a young Mexican American by the name of Martin Morales, he recalled very vividly having to stand in line in town, just outside San Antonio, and his family would have to wait in a long line for a handout on a weekly basis from local relief agencies. So there were some local agencies trying to give out food to people. And every week, he would have to go and stand in line, he and his family, and they would wait for a loaf of bread. However, he noticed that whenever his family got to the front of the line, not all, but certain of the people who were handing out the food, the agent would refuse to give them the food and instead, quote, send them to the back of the line, unquote, and make them wait all over again. Just because he was of Mexican descent. Remember, he was born in San Antonio, he's American. Because he had dark-colored skin, he was sent to the back of the line. Oh, and then things got worse. Because from 1929 through 1935, the United States initiated a coerced, voluntary repatriation campaign to deport as many Spanish speakers back to Mexico as they could, rather than provide them aid, often whether they were U.S. citizens or not. For example, this is called repatriation. Basically, repatriation is a nicer word than saying deport, because you're going to send them back for their own good, supposedly. That's the idea of repatriation. Repatriate means you send them back for their own good. This is not for their own good. This is to get them out of our country so you don't have to deal with them. So what would happen is in places like Los Angeles, they would commonly have like your town squares, your city squares in between buildings, and police often would surround these because there's very few exits to them. And they would surround these town squares where known Mexican and Mexican Americans were known to gather. And what they would do is they'd hurry up and rush the area and surround them and force Mexicans and Mexican Americans to produce papers to show, I'm here, I have documentation, I should be here, I have a license, or whatever the paperwork is. And if you could not produce that paperwork immediately, you were thrown in jail and held. Now, you could be there for a few days until someone was able to prove you were indeed supposed to be either a citizen or just a resident. But if you were not able to prove it, or someone couldn't come and do it for you, they didn't know where you're at. Remember, they don't tell you. They don't call your family. Or if they just had the train going by right then, depending on what day it was, they would just throw you on a train and ship you back to Mexico. And they just dump you over the border. You didn't have time to even pack your stuff. You just dumped over the border. In places like Chicago and Detroit even. Yes, Mexicans and Mexican Americans live in Chicago and Detroit. Fun fact, Chicago was the second largest concentration of Mexican descended people outside of Mexico. LA is number 1. Chicago is number 2. But local relief agencies in Chicago and Detroit, it was common for them to basically lie directly to the face of Mexican and Mexican Americans and say, hey, I'll tell you what, why don't you just go back to Mexico? The economy's bad right now, right? Go back to Mexico. just for a couple of years. And once the economy gets better, come on back over. Once the economy rights itself, no big deal. We'll welcome you back. The problem, that's a lie. Because once they agree to this, again, this is coerced, voluntary. Because if they left because they were in poverty, in destitute, hence the need to repatriate. Because they were leaving because they were destitute, immigration officials upon reentry would deny them access because they would view them as a LPC, liable to become a public charge. Because they said, hey, you were already destitute when you left. What makes you different now? You're going to become destitute again and be a drain in our society. And so if a Mexican left, chose repatriation because they were lied to, they were most often not allowed to re-enter the country despite being told they would be able to. Yeah, it was this bad. Scholars and historians estimate that between 1929 and 1935, nearly 1 million people of Mexican descent were deported, repatriated to Mexico. 1 million persons of Mexican descent. But 600,000 of those 1 million people were legal U.S. citizens, born or naturalized. So scholars estimate 1 million people were deported. 60% were U.S. citizens, born or naturalized. Hence the term coerced voluntary repatriation. Hence, now to be fair, I want you to understand this fully, right? A large number of that 600,000 were probably children who were born here. And when their parents, who maybe were not naturalized, they crossed the border, legally, they had work visas, but when they chose to go back and become repatriated, either through coercion or voluntary, they took the kids with them because you're not going to leave the kids without the parents, right? That just makes sense. So a good number of the 600,000 were children, but doesn't matter. 600,000 U.S. citizens were deported by the U.S. government between 1929 and 1935 in the name of convenience rather than actually create something to help them. These are U.S. citizens. And by the way, this is a topic you like. Please take a good Mexican American Studies course. So we have time to go more detail on this. And then things got worse for our country. Now I'm going to give this short version here. What is the Dust Bowl? It is the Depression, the Great Depression, plus drought. So what we've talked about thus far is mostly urban centers, right? The unemployment rates, the factories, the banks, the immigration issues, the African American, most of that has to do with cities. But when you go into the Midwest and the Plains region, we have all those farmers there. And adding to the economic suffering, the racial prejudice was the fact that during the 1930s, not only were we in a depression, we will face an ecological disaster. Each year between 1932 and 1939, there were an average of 50 dust storms per year that would destroy 1,500 square miles from Oklahoma to western Kansas. This was dubbed the Dust Bowl. And the effects of this were felt as far away as the Dakotas and down into Texas. Now, nature played a huge role here, but the Dirty 30s was primarily human-caused. Remember what I told you in our Westward lecture, the Western Expansion lecture? How this land that people moved to during westward expansion, part of the Homestead Act, this land was not suitable for farming. Only by rerouting rivers, by clear cutting the land, by forcibly changing the ecology of the environment, were they able to grow lots of food there and make a profit. At some point, changing the ecology, the natural ecology, is going to cause a disaster. And it just so happened the chickens came home to roost during the Great Depression. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been in a dust storm. I have. I'm originally from Michigan, right? I was driving from Texas to Michigan one time, and I just left Arkansas, got into Missouri, heading about halfway home, and suddenly a dust storm hit. And I'm not joking. I couldn't see 10 feet in front of my car in broad daylight because it was so dark. Now, fortunately, I was able to pull aside the road. There happened to be a way station for trucks right nearby. I was able to pull off the road safely and actually park behind the little guard shack at the way station and wait it out. But if you ever, that's a very freaky experience. It was said that dust, go back to my previous map real quick for you. This dust bowl, it was said that you could see dust particles all the way to Washington, D.C. That's how far it spread across our country, how massive these dust storms were, an average of 50 per year. And the problem is they had clear cut all the trees. There's not a lot of trees there anyway. They cut them all down, though, which means the trees would provide a natural barrier against the wind to prevent dust storms. The trees are no longer there thanks to them clear cutting it to produce more farmland. Again, ecological change. They're changing the ecology of the land. And think about it for a minute. Who got hit the worst here? Sharecroppers. Remember, these large, huge, big conglomerates, the agribusiness farms, plantation style, these huge businesses, they can survive on sheer number. But when you're a sharecropper or a tenant farmer, you have a very small parcel of land, and usually it's the worst land you were already given. So what happens when the wind comes through there? You have nothing left. Your soil's been blown away. You have no money to buy more supplies. You can't get a loan from the banks. The banks are closing. And again, like so many others, you are destitute, which is one of the reasons why it really impacts both African Americans and Mexican Americans so much, because demographically, statistically, some of the largest numbers of sharecroppers are African Americans and Mexican Americans. Now, so much so that people began to leave in mass, and especially white farmers. They began to leave in mass and began a trek, often starting with their cars, and by the time they can't buy gas, they're ditching the cars and walking to get to California, trying to find something better. Now, these people were most often from Oklahoma, and they were dubbed the term Okies. And they would often travel in hordes because they found that life in the West had finally beaten them. It was just too much. And they would often move from farm to farm as they went, picking fruit and working at starvation level wages. And of course, if you want to hear more about this, read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. It'll talk about and describe in great detail the plight of these farmers during the Great Depression. So, life sucks. It's depressing. We have 25% unemployment nationwide, 50% for African Americans. We have 1 million Mexicans being deported, 6% are US citizens. The farmers are screwed, especially if you're a sharecropper, a poor white, African American, Mexican American. But don't worry, our faithful President Herbert Hoover has a plan. Still waiting. Oh, that's what his plan was. He told, remember his idea of economic was called welfare capitalism? That companies should voluntarily do the right thing? Yep, he applied it to the Great Depression too. He urged businesses to keep their doors open and maintain their current wages. In other words, Businesses, just keep paying your employees for a full day's wage, even though they're not working a full day and not producing any goods and you're not selling any goods. Just take a loss. Absorb the shock of the depression. And basically allow your corporate profits to dwindle. Sound good? Anyone? Any business? Yeah. Hence why welfare capitalism is naive. When times are tough, again, welfare capitalism might work somewhat in really good economic times. But when the depression hits, it's not going to work. They're not going to take a loss just to help someone else out. And this idea that the good times are just around the corner, he kept, oh, it's just around the corner, good times are coming again, is a dark joke. And sure enough, in 1930, the midterm elections, Democrats sweep into the House and Senate, which thing makes things even more hostile to Herbert Hoover. Again, to put it mildly, Hoover responded terribly to this disaster. He responded poorly to the Depression. Hoover believed and stated that it would end within 6 months. It'll magically just disappear one day. But as it continued to go on and linger and get worse and spread further across our country to other groups of people, he became the object of ridicule and scorn. He attempted to solve the problems with volunteer programs like soup kitchens. Those are great. Churches should step up and do things. Yes, they should. But when you have a nationwide disaster, a unified government response was needed. He did, to be fair, attempt a few public works projects, but he insisted on balancing the budget at the same time, which means even less money for the programs. He continued to maintain that trickle-down economics would work, that welfare capitalism would work. And when he did finally, in 1932, he finally gave emergency loans to big businesses, preaching that trickle-down economics would work. But that the money given to big businesses, they didn't turn around and give it to their employees. They hoarded it. And therefore, the ordinary person saw nothing. Again, it was something. He didn't do nothing. He did try some things. But it was very limited and amounted to no help. And then it got worse for Herbert Hoover, because his worst response to the Great Depression also occurred in summer of 1932. Now, in 1932, there was a group of World War I veterans who began to protest against Herbert Hoover. Why? Background. These were World War I veterans who served our country, and in 1924, Congress had awarded these World War I veterans with a $1,000 bonus to be paid by a government bond. Now, if you don't know a government bond, how it works, like a savings bond, what it is you buy a bond now, and then you wait 20 years or 10 years or 50 years, and it will mature. So you might pay $50 for it now, and then you wait 10 years, and you cash it in for $100. Or you pay $100 and wait 20 years, it'll be $500. And so this bonus in 1924 was a 20-year bond that would mature in 1945 for $1,000. Again, it's a bonus. I'm not debating whether this is a good or bad thing. This is what they did. Well, this bonus was sitting in banks gathering interest, right? The money's supposedly there. Or at least it's partially there at least. And so in 1932, a group that called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, so the Bonus Expeditionary Force, aka the Bonus Army, they started in Portland, Oregon, and began to march across the country to Washington, D.C. And of course, as they traveled, they gathered more and more people to the cause. By the time they got to Washington, D.C., they were 40,000 strong. About 20,000 veterans and about 20,000 family members, wives, and children, who they might as well go along because there's nothing for them back at home. And so the bonus army set up camp on the southeast side of the Capitol and began to petition Congress to pay them the bonus early. At the very least, give them part of it, right? It's been 10 years. Give them part of it. They need the money now. What good is $1,000 10 years from now, 1945, when you're going to starve and die now? And the government's going to save that money because they're not going to give it to you. So they set up camp. And remember, these veterans are also destitute. And they begin to petition Congress. Now, the House of Representatives said, you know what? You make a very valid argument. You deserve the bonus. Sure, we will grant you the bonus. The Senate said no. Hoover, the president, he refused to even meet and talk with the veterans, the bonus army. Despite public opinion in support of honoring this request from our war heroes, right? The troops, these veterans, popular support was in their favor. Yeah, the House said yes, the Senate said no, okay. Hoover wouldn't even talk to them. And then Hoover does the unthinkable. In July of 1932, Herbert Hoover orders the U.S. military to go in with guns, tear gas, and clear out their camp. In July of 1932, in summer of 32, Herbert Hoover orders the U.S. military to clear out the bonus army encampment using force, if necessary. Future World War II heroes, Douglas MacArthur, talk about him later, and George Patton. They entered the camp, sent some tents ablaze, set them on fire, and began using tear gas on the protesters. More than 100 veterans were wounded, and at least one dead infant. This legacy of the bonus army debacle, this is wrong. It hardened public opinion against Hoover. Remember, this is 1932. This is an election year. And basically would seal Hoover's fate in the election. Now, the rest of the country was not doing much better, obviously. This picture here is affectionately known as a Hooverville. Hoovervilles were these makeshift shanty-style homes, usually next to railroad yards. They took scraps from the railroad yard and hastily built shanty houses. And the people who lived there who had lost their homes because the banks had foreclosed, they couldn't afford to pay out their debts, they actually called them Hoovervilles in honor of the despised Herbert Hoover because they believed he was the one responsible for this economic depression and their destitution. He did nothing to help them. So due to his association with the Depression, due to the disastrous fight with the bonus army, Hoover's going to get annihilated in the 1932 election by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I have no idea what Pennsylvania was thinking. In 1932 will end the Republican domination of the presidency that had lasted for 36 years. Think about it. Since Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, since then there were only 2 Democrats from 1860 to 1932. All those presidents in between, from 1860 to 1932, there was the Bourbon Democrat, Grover Cleveland, and there was Woodrow Wilson. Every other president was a Republican. And Franklin Roosevelt's ascendancy in 1932 is going to change that tide for about the next 50 years. But that is a topic that we will talk about in our future lectures. For now, though, just realize that he's the first Democrat. Again, this is a new wave. Remember, Wilson only won the presidency because he split the Republican vote between Teddy and Taft. But nonetheless, one of my favorite photos in history, FDR's inauguration. Him riding down Pennsylvania Avenue for his inauguration. And next to him is the former president, Herbert Hoover. He looks so happy. And I always just picture, how would this election have, or how would that look nowadays if the loser would have to ride next to the winner? I mean, can you imagine Barack Obama riding next to Donald Trump at Trump's inauguration? Or if Trump loses in this upcoming 2020 election, can you imagine Trump riding next to Joe Biden, assuming Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee? It's almost comical to think about, and Hoover's face says it all right there. But again, we will talk more about what happens next in our next lecture, in next future lectures. But until then, take care and bye-bye.